I don't want to cry about it, but in fact, everything was really terrible.
Welcome to Watch Mojo, and today we'll be counting down our picks for the 10 cities in the world that were destroyed and then rebuilt.
And it really gives you that feeling of resilience and of history.
For this list, we're looking at cities that were severely damaged, be it by a war or a natural disaster, but were then rebuilt. Let us know in the comments which reconstruction you think was the most impressive. Number 10. Mostar, Bosnia and Herzegovina. During the long, extremely complex and widely devastating collapse of Yugoslavia during the 1990s, one of the cities worst hit by the fighting was Mostar in Bosnia and Herzegovina.
There are no safe places in East Mostar. You can be killed or maimed at any time on any street corner. Until you see it happening, it's hard to realize how quickly lives can be destroyed.
When the country was at war with Croatia, Mostar was besieged by Croatian forces. The largest architectural casualty was the huge Stari Most, the city's 500-year-old bridge.
The famous bridge over the Neretva has been rebuilt by UNESCO at a cost of millions. But it's mainly used by the tourists. Many of the locals have not crossed into the other side of the city since the war.
But other buildings, like the Serb Orthodox Zitomislić Monastery, were destroyed by the fighting as well. Nobody has ever really been held accountable for the destruction of the bridge, but funds were donated to rebuild it in the 2000s. It remains a major historic monument and a symbol of the war.
Mostar's bridge has been rebuilt, but politics here are as divisive as ever.
Number 9. Chicago, USA.
It became a story about resilience and rebuilding and being tough. And it's interesting that even as we look back 150 years later, quite little has changed about how we tell the story.
In 1871, huge swaths of Chicago, one of America's most famous and populous cities, were destroyed in a citywide fire. By some accounts, it broke out in a barn and ended up demolishing over 17,000 buildings and killing hundreds of people.
The one thing you can say for sure is it started in the cow barn behind the O'Leary home on DeKoven Street. That's for a fact.
100,000 people were displaced, and the cost was in the hundreds of millions in 1871 dollars. It became known as the Great Chicago Fire, and it raged for 2 days, forcing a massive evacuation.
The residents, they're losing everything. Everything that they knew and had was going up in flames.
But Chicago, of course, didn't take the tragic fire lying down. The city regrouped, and a massive reconstruction got underway, giving the city the infrastructure it needed to become a U.S. metropolitan center rivaled only by New York and Los Angeles.
Chicago's Great Fire was the spark that led to brilliant innovations in the skyscraper and the creation of one of the most dazzling skylines in the world.
Number 8. Warsaw, Poland.
That day, one world became another.
It was Germany's invasion of Poland in 1939 that finally caused the outbreak of the Second World War, and the country remained occupied by Nazis until its liberation in early 1945. The Poles suffered significantly during the war, with Poland becoming the site of many concentration camps, and a huge uprising began in 1944 in Warsaw, the capital.
All around, the walls were almost red hot, and people were being herded along. On both sides of the streets, burning debris was coming down. Warsaw was on fire, and you could feel it.
It ultimately failed, and in revenge, the Nazis took it upon themselves to completely raze the city. Destruction so brutal that Warsaw's reconstruction was almost deemed impossible. Almost.
Not only the Jewish nation perished, above all, Poles perished, because the Germans had a plan to destroy us.
In the end, Warsaw was painstakingly rebuilt according to old maps and even some valuable paintings, in an undertaking that took decades.
The city was completely destroyed during the Second World War and then rebuilt without any help from Germany.
Number 7. Tokyo, Japan. The Great Kanto earthquake struck the island of Honshu in 1923 with a magnitude of 7.9, becoming one of the most destructive and deadliest natural disasters on record.
A few minutes later, it was followed by a strong aftershock. Total chaos was unleashed when the ground shook for a third time.
Over 100,000 people died, even by more conservative estimates, with the earthquake also causing huge fires and even a tornado at one point, as well as a tsunami and typhoon that happened at the same time. Almost 2 million people were displaced and 500,000 homes destroyed.
The new Tokyo emphatically asserted its status as a big, modern, 20th century city.
Tokyo was extensively rebuilt afterward, with authorities prioritizing safety from future earthquakes, which is one reason why Tokyo has a lot of parks. Today, Tokyo is one of the biggest and most advanced cities on Earth. Number 6. London, UK. Though London and a few other British cities was heavily damaged most recently during the Blitz, which took place in 1940 and 1941, it was destroyed much more thoroughly way back in 1666.
It's broken out at the wrong time in the wrong place. It's broken out in the early hours of the morning. It's right next to huge stores of inflammable materials, and it takes out the Great Water Wheel from the Thames, which pumps up water.
This was when the Great Fire of London occurred, beginning in a bakery on Pudding Lane and quickly spreading through the many close-knit wooden buildings and thatched roofs.
The immediate effect of the fire on the city of London was that people left. They eventually would end up camping in places like Spitalfields or Moorfields, those fields just outside the city, and then they'd go even further to Highgate or Highbury, up the hill.
Remarkably, though most of the city was completely destroyed, only 6 people are recorded to have died. The entire centre had to be rebuilt, including St. Paul's Cathedral. But centuries later, London would become a huge capital, showing no evidence of the devastating fire.
Incredibly, just 10 years after the Great Fire, most of the city was up and running again. These days, London is a bustling hub of activity, as it has been for centuries. The old houses and churches, now overshadowed by office blocks and skyscrapers.
Number 5. San Francisco, USA. One of America's deadliest earthquakes struck the San Francisco Bay Area in 1906, causing a tsunami and an outbreak of massive fires.
Over the next 90 seconds, the rupture travels north and south along the fault, eventually traversing hundreds of miles.
Over 3,000 people may have died during the disaster, which is still remembered in the area today for the monumental damage it caused, with the majority of the city's population left homeless.
Keeping people awake to that reality is a challenge that we go at every day.
A huge reconstruction effort began, led largely by urban planner Daniel Burnham, which saw San Francisco recreated better than before, and with better protection from future earthquakes. San Francisco has since become one of the country's major cultural hubs, and the Bay Area is home to Silicon Valley. Number 4. Beirut, Lebanon. For 15 years, Lebanon was gripped by a horrendous civil war that saw long-term unrest and the deaths of more than 100,000 people. Beirut, the capital, was one of the worst affected areas, with its downtown being completely leveled by the fighting. Painstakingly, Beirut was rebuilt from 1990 onwards and became a city home to millions of people. Today, the city is rebuilding once again following the large explosion in 2020 caused by a warehouse fire.
Once again, the Lebanese are rebuilding their nation after a futile and deadly tragedy. This may be Lebanon's darkest hour, but there is hope buried beneath the rubble.
But Beirut survived the raging civil war, and many relief organizations immediately went to work to provide help to those who needed it.
25 years after peace returned, Beirut has had a makeover. Millionaires' yachts are moored in the marina, and downtown has been entirely rebuilt.
Number 3. Dresden, Germany.
Nothing prepared me for what I saw at Dresden. Nothing.
Though the world was at war, most scholars agree today that the horrific firebombing of Dresden was a completely unnecessary show of force, possibly even a war crime. That's because Dresden wasn't home to a military presence or any bases. The city was wholly destroyed by the Allied 3-day-long air raid in February 1945, leaving very few buildings and landmarks intact.
After a 10-hour flight, the first wave of bombers approached Dresden. The city below was ill-prepared for its fate. The resulting fires could be seen from a distance of 80 kilometers away.
Up to 25,000 people, primarily civilians, including many children, lost their lives. After the war, the effort to rebuild Dresden got underway, but as recently as 2021, some major buildings were still being restored.
The capital of the state of Saxony is held up as a rare East German success story today, Historians, like Frederick Taylor, however, say that even though the city has been largely rebuilt, the trauma is intense and it has never recovered from a diffuse grief and cultural pessimism.
Germany's capital, Berlin, was also heavily bombed by the Allies and ultimately rebuilt. Number 2. Lisbon, Portugal. An estimated 7.7 magnitude quake struck off the coast of Portugal on November 1st, 1755, eventually reaching the country's capital, Lisbon, and doing untold damage. Up to 50,000 may have died, almost a quarter of the city's total population, and almost 90% of the buildings were razed. The Royal Palace, Carmo Convent, and Royal Hospital were all destroyed, either in the quake or the fires that followed. Rather than rebuild according to what was there before, brand new sections of the city were built on the orders of the king in a reconstruction effort that took decades. The earthquake remains a huge part of Portuguese history and is one of the largest to ever hit the European continent.
Before we continue, be sure to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell to get notified about our latest videos. You have the option to be notified for occasional videos or all of them. If you're on your phone, make sure you go into your settings and switch on notifications.
Number 1. Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan.
Solid matter began to come apart, releasing untold quantities of energy.
In quick succession, the large Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki had the first and only atomic bombs deployed in war dropped on them, devastating both. Like Dresden, it was primarily civilians who lost their lives, with the death toll estimation ranging from roughly 220,000 to over 1 million. The cities were also ravaged with nuclear fallout and radiation. With many buildings completely destroyed, absolutely nothing was left.
The second bomb was intended for the city of Kokura, but it was too cloudy, so the plane moved on to Nagasaki. Desperately short of fuel, the crew released the bomb despite more clouds.
Both cities have since been rebuilt in the aftermath of World War II, with large monuments and memorials in both honoring the many non-combatants who lost their lives. Today, Hiroshima has a population of over 1.1 million, and Nagasaki a population approaching 500,000 and growing.
Do you agree with our picks? Check out this other recent clip from WatchMojo, and be sure to subscribe and ring the bell to be notified about our latest videos.